Some moments don't echo when they end, they just vanish like a slammed car door in an empty lot. The door hit my face with a final thud. Then came his voice, low and hard. "Fend for yourself." The cold rushed in. I blinked against the wind, my hand still frozen on the handle. The truck's engine growled as he shifted into gear. My mother stared straight ahead like she was afraid to breathe. No one looked back. I opened my mouth to speak, but the sound of tires grinding over snow drowned everything out. They didn't wait. They didn't explain. They didn't even slow down. And just like that, I was standing alone beside a diner in the middle of nowhere, Montana. No coat, no phone, no goodbye. I didn't move. Part of me still believed they'd circle back. Maybe they'd laugh, say it was a joke, but the red taillights disappeared like the warmth in my fingertips, quiet and quick. The wind curled under my sweatshirt and pinched my skin. My backpack felt heavier than it had all morning, even though it only carried a spiral notebook, one pair of socks, and a balled-up granola bar wrapper. That's all I had thought to grab. That, and the crumpled $5 bill I had shoved deep into the side pocket without thinking. I looked up at the diner. Its flickering neon sign buzzed against the quiet, coffee 99 cents, missing a bulb like it had long given up on appearances. I shuffled toward the door, not because I had a plan, but because the wind hurt less when I moved. Inside, the air smelled like burnt grease and cleaning fluid. A waitress mopped under the booths, her ponytail limp with end-of-shift weariness. She didn't look up. "Kitchen's closed," she said flatly. I nodded. "You waiting for someone?" My voice barely made it out. "No." She hesitated, gave a half glance to my shoes, my sweatshirt, then pointed to a stool near a wall heater. "You can sit there if you want. Warm up a bit." The heater hummed like an old man clearing his throat. I sat down slowly, letting the warmth reach my ankles. It didn't go much farther. Outside, the gray light began to dim. Not quite sunset, but the kind of winter twilight that made everything look older. Cars passed on the highway in uneven rhythms. None turned in. I wrapped my arms tighter around my backpack, not because I was cold, though I was, but because it was the last thing I had left that felt mine. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch at school, half a peanut butter sandwich and 2 carrot sticks. I'd thrown away the milk carton, like always. The waitress returned briefly with a paper cup. "Tap water," she said, setting it down without fanfare. "On the house." I managed a quiet thanks, though I wasn't sure she heard. The water tasted like metal. I drank it anyway. I wanted to believe this was temporary, that my dad would stomp back in, muttering about how I needed to learn a lesson, and Mom would follow behind, handing me a jacket like it was all some big misunderstanding. But I'd seen their faces, heard the way Dad's voice didn't shake when he told me to fend for myself, seen how Mom didn't even flinch. The heater coughed out one last puff of air before going quiet. The waitress flipped the sign on the door, closed, and gave me a look that wasn't unkind, just tired. I stood up, nodded, and walked out before she had to ask. The wind slapped me in the face as soon as the door clicked shut. The sky had turned a bruised kind of blue, heavy with snow that hadn't yet started to fall. I pulled my sleeves over my hands and walked to the alley between the diner and a boarded-up service station. It wasn't much, but the dumpster blocked some of the wind. I found a dry patch of concrete behind a stack of tires. I sat, knees tucked to my chest, and rested my head against the cold metal wall. For a while, there was nothing but the sound of my breath and the occasional rush of a car far off in the distance. Then something shifted. A sound, soft, slow, deliberate, gravel crunching under footsteps. I froze. The sound stopped just short of the corner, then retreating. A few seconds passed. I peeked around the edge. No one. But near the dumpster, a brown paper bag sat neatly on the ground, weighted down by a bottle of water. No note, no footprints I could see. I approached slowly, heart pounding in my ears. Inside the bag was a sandwich, white bread, ham, nothing fancy, and a small packet of saltine crackers. It wasn't warm, but it was fresh. Real, not trash. I didn't eat it right away. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers tightening and loosening around the bag, like I expected it to disappear. Like maybe it wasn't meant for me, but I was the only one here. I took the sandwich back to the tires, sat down, and unwrapped the wax paper with slow, careful hands. The bread was a little stale at the edges. The ham was plain, no mustard, no extras. But it was food. I ate half, tucking the other half back into the bag for later. The crackers I slipped into my backpack. That sandwich was the first kind thing that had happened to me in days. I didn't know who had left it or why. Maybe they saw me and didn't want to get involved. Maybe they thought food would be enough. Or maybe, just maybe, they didn't need to be thanked. I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes. Inside the backpack was only a notebook, wet socks, and a crumpled $5 bill. No phone, no hope. The cold didn't hit all at once. It crept in, like the silence after being forgotten. I woke with a jolt, my cheek pressed to the concrete behind the stack of tires. My whole body ached in that heavy, fuzzy way that only comes from sleeping outside. The sandwich bag was still under my arm, half crushed, but the other half of the sandwich was there. I hadn't dreamed it. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes drifting down like they had all the time in the world. I sat up slowly, brushing off crumbs, and a piece of saltine stuck to my sleeve. My breath formed little clouds. I curled tighter into my sweatshirt, which was already stretched thin across my knees. The diner's lights were off now. No more humming neon, just the dull glow of dawn pressing against the overcast sky. I thought about the paper bag and the way it had just appeared. Someone had left it there for me. On purpose, without a word or expectation, just a sandwich and a bottle of water. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or embarrassed, maybe both. I tucked the rest of the food away and stood up, my legs stiff from the cold. The streets were mostly empty, the only movement being a few birds pecking at frozen trash and the occasional rustle of wind through the alley. I didn't want to go far, I had nowhere to go, but sitting still made the cold worse. So I walked. There was an old church a few blocks down. White steeple, crooked sign that read, "Hope is louder than silence." I almost rolled my eyes, but the warmth leaking from its front windows made me pause. I crept closer, my footsteps quiet on the snow-covered sidewalk. Inside, rows of wooden pews lined a small chapel. A tall man in a thick wool coat was stacking hymnals at the end of the aisle. His silver hair glinted under the stained glass window. He moved with a kind of patience that didn't feel forced. He looked up and saw me through the open door. Didn't say anything. Just gave a slow nod and turned back to the books. I hesitated, one foot inside, one foot out. I didn't want a lecture or a sermon. I didn't even want a seat. I just wanted a break from the wind. Before I could decide, he walked toward the vestibule and held out a paper cup. "Hot cocoa," he said simply. I blinked. "For me?" "Why not?" he said with a half smile. "You look like you've been out here long enough." I took it with both hands. The heat spread into my fingers, prickling as the circulation returned. "Name's Ray Duncan, pastor here." He extended a gloved hand. I didn't shake it. "Lena." He didn't seem offended. "Well, Lena, the church is open most mornings. You're welcome to warm up. No questions asked." That last part landed heavier than the rest. He meant it. No questions, no judgment. I sat near the back pew sipping the cocoa slowly. It was mostly warm milk with a hint of chocolate, but it tasted like Christmas. Ray went back to his work, humming a song I didn't recognize. He didn't try to fill the silence, and for that, I was grateful. A few minutes later, he disappeared into a side room and returned with a blanket, not new but clean and soft. "You don't have to take it," he said, setting it beside me, "but it's going to get colder before it gets warmer." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I nodded. Outside, the snow began to fall harder. After a while, I slipped the blanket around my shoulders and made my way back toward the diner alley, not because I wanted to leave, but because something in me still didn't trust warmth, not yet. As I turned the corner, I stopped. Another brown paper bag sat near the dumpster, just like yesterday. A bottle of water beside it. This time there was something else, an orange, bright, whole, untouched. I looked around. No one. I stepped forward, picked it up, and noticed a faint smell of tobacco on the paper. Familiar, like the kind my grandfather used to smoke when I was little. I scanned the street. A figure was walking away slowly, hands in his pockets, head down. He wore a heavy jacket with a frayed collar and boots that dragged slightly with each step. I only saw the back of him, but something told me it was the same person from last night. He didn't turn around. I wanted to yell. Ask why he was doing this, but the words felt too heavy for my mouth. Instead, I walked back to the church. Ray was sitting by the fireplace in a small room off the side. He didn't seem surprised to see me. Found something good? He asked, nodding toward the bag in my hands. I nodded. Sandwich and an orange. Sounds like someone out there's looking out for you. I didn't answer, but I didn't disagree. Later, when I returned to the spot behind the tires for the night, I opened my notebook, the one thing from school I still had. The pages were warped, corners bent. Most of it was filled with math notes, and one bad poem I'd never admit to write in. I tore out a fresh page and stared at it for a long time. Then I wrote, "Tonight someone noticed I exist. Hope is strange. It doesn't arrive in speeches, it comes in quiet acts. Like hot soup and unlocked doors. That morning, I didn't wake up shivering. For the first time in days, my blanket wasn't a damp hoodie or a garbage bag. It was soft, worn fleece that smelled faintly of cedar and fireplace ash. I held it tighter around my shoulders as I sat up behind the stack of tires. The snow had softened overnight, covering the alley like a white apology. I brushed flakes off my boots and stood slowly, my body stiff but not frozen. In my backpack, the leftover orange from last night's meal waited untouched. I was saving it. For what, I didn't know, maybe just to prove I had something left. I made my way toward the church again. Ray had said I was welcome, and I needed to believe someone meant that. The side door creaked open without resistance. Inside, warmth greeted me before any words did. The chapel was quiet, but a faint hum of music played from somewhere, maybe a cassette, maybe the radio, something old and soft. Ray stood at the small table near the altar, ladling soup into a thermos. He looked up and smiled like I had expected. "Morning," he said. "I figured you'd be back." I hesitated in the doorway, unsure how much to accept. "I can go if you need me to." He shook his head. "No one gets kicked out of a place like this for showing up." He poured a second cup of coffee and gestured to a wooden chair near the fire. I took it slowly, letting the steam ease the tightness in my chest. "I have some forms I need to take into town today," he said. "Social services stuff. Want to come along? Might be useful." I blinked. "Useful for what?" "To figure out what's next. You don't have to decide anything today, but it's easier to talk about futures when there's heat and paperwork involved." I nodded. I didn't have a plan, but going with him felt less terrifying than staying alone. We drove in a dusty sedan that smelled like pine air freshener and old church bulletins. On the way, Ray pointed out places like they were familiar: Claridge Pharmacy, Old Mill Park, the diner where folks still smoked out back like it was 1982. At the county office, a woman named Ellen White met us with a clipboard in one hand and a lukewarm smile on her face. She was tall, thin, with the kind of glasses that looked too narrow for her head. She didn't shake my hand, but offered a firm nod. "You're Lena." I nodded. "She's not in the system," Ray said quietly, "but she's in need." Ellen pursed her lips and motioned us into a small office with mismatched chairs and a desk covered in sticky notes. For the next half hour, I answered questions I didn't want to answer. Name, birthday, last known address. Did I feel safe at home? Did I have a family? Did I know how to contact them? Ray didn't speak much except to confirm the date or clarify something I mumbled too quietly. At one point, Ellen leaned back in her chair and said, "If your parents come looking for you, things could get complicated." I stared at her, unsure if she was warning me or preparing me. "They won't," I said. "They made that clear." She nodded, scribbling something down I couldn't see. Eventually, she handed me a form and a pen. "Temporary placement request, just in case." I signed it without looking at the lines. Ray placed a steady hand on my shoulder, just for a second. It was the first time someone touched me without making me flinch. Back at the church, I sat in the side room again, my body sagging against the armrest of the old chair. A tray of bread and cheese sat beside me, untouched. The sun outside was just beginning to dip, casting long gold streaks through the stained glass window. Dust floated in the light like tiny messengers. There was a creak from the hallway. I turned and saw him, Travis. He stood near the door, one hand holding something, the other buried deep in the pocket of his coat. He didn't say anything, just stepped forward and placed a folded piece of fabric on the chair beside me. It was a scarf. Purple, software newer than anything I'd touched in weeks. "I didn't know if you had one," he said, voice low. I looked up at him. "Thank you." He shrugged. "Just thought you might need it." He turned to go, but then paused. "That orange. Yesterday. You knew it was me?" "I guessed." He nodded once. "You're good at staying quiet." "I've had a lot of practice." He left after that. No more words, no requests. But when I opened the scarf, something fell out. A small note, barely a sentence. "You matter more than you know." Kindness doesn't knock. It just shows up, in wool, in warmth, in the quiet corners of a cold town. I never really noticed the color purple until that week. It had always felt like a strange in-between, too serious to be playful, too soft to be bold. But when I wrapped the scarf Travis gave me around my neck, it felt like a message, something unspoken that still meant everything. Ray said there were things to do before the Christmas Eve service, chairs to rearrange, lights to check, hymnals to stack. He gave me a clipboard and a roll of tape like I'd been on staff for years. And I didn't mind. Moving chairs gave my hands something to do, and something about the way the old wood creaked under pressure made me feel like I wasn't the only one with a few cracks left. Clayridge was small enough that everyone knew each other, but big enough that they could still pretend they didn't. Most people smiled politely when they saw me in the church hall. A few offered cookies, some made small talk. No one asked questions I didn't want to answer. It was during one of those setup shifts that I met her. She sat in the corner of the library room just off the main hall, knitting something with thick, plum-colored yarn. Her fingers moved slowly but steadily, like she'd been doing it since before television was invented. A pair of reading glasses perched halfway down her nose, and her gray hair was tied back with a ribbon that matched her yarn. I paused in the doorway, unsure if I was interrupting. "You're Lena," she said, not looking up. I nodded slowly. "Pastor Ray mentioned you." She finally met my eyes. "I'm Helen Murphy. Don't worry, I don't bite." I smiled, just a little, and stepped in. "Come here," she said, patting the chair next to her. "I won't make you knit, but I could use someone to hold this skein while I untangle it." I sat, letting the ball of yarn rest in my hands. It was warm from her fingers, soft and thick like the scarf around my neck. "I used to work in the town library," she said. 37 years. I knew every kid's name and half their birthdays. Most of them probably don't remember me." "I would," I said, surprising myself. Helen chuckled. "That's kind of you." She didn't ask about my parents, didn't pry into why I was here or where I was staying. Instead, she told me about her cat, Marmalade, who had an attitude and a penchant for knocking over water glasses. "You know," she said, threading her needle again, "people always think kindness has to be loud, big, like confetti or parades. But I've found it usually shows up like this: a chair, a scarf, a name remembered when no one else bothered." She looked down at my scarf and smiled. "That one's Travis's handiwork, huh? I taught him how to knit when he was 12. Said it helped him think straighter when things got loud at home." I ran my hand along the edge of the fabric. "He left it for me without saying anything." "That's how he does things," she said. "Don't mistake quiet for indifference. Some of the kindest people are the ones who speak the least." I didn't realize how much those words would stick. That evening, after most folks had gone home and Ray was finishing a phone call in his office, I sat in one of the pews and listened to the wind press against the stained glass. The purple scarf was still around my neck, warm even in the drafty chapel. Helen found me there again, this time with a box of little handmade ornaments. "You're helping with the tree," she said. "No arguments." We decorated in silence, the two of us moving around each other, like dancers who'd practiced the same steps forever. When we were done, she handed me one last ornament, a small crocheted angel with crooked wings. "This one's yours," she said, placing it in my palm. "Why?" "Because you're still here," she replied, "and that counts for something." Later, as I walked back to the room Ray had set up for me, just a cot, a wool blanket, and a small dresser, I found a note tucked into the pocket of my coat. The handwriting was narrow, tidy. "You don't have to believe you belong here. We already do." I didn't know who wrote it. Maybe Helen, maybe Ray, maybe someone who saw me and decided I deserved a place even before I believed it myself. In the quiet of that room, with the scarf still around my shoulders and the angel cradled in my hand, I realized something. In this little town with its old hymnals and paper cups of cocoa, people didn't talk about saving you. They just quietly refused to let you fall. In my pocket, the purple yarn felt like armor. In my chest, something softened. And in the dark corner of my borrowed dresser drawer sat a folded napkin, scribbled with a new sentence: "You belong, even if you don't believe it yet." No one asked me to join, but they made room anyway. The church smelled like cinnamon and fresh baked bread the morning of Christmas, the kind of smell that pulls memories out of people, whether they want them or not. I'd never had a Christmas like this, never decorated a tree with someone who wasn't yelling or crying, never sat through carols without wondering if someone would storm out halfway through. But that morning, things felt different. Not magical, just steady, grounded. Pastor Ray was already in his good sweater, the blue one with snowflakes stitched around the collar. He handed me a stack of napkins without saying a word, and I started laying them out across the folding tables in the multi-purpose room. Helen was at the end of the table, arranging silverware and muttering to herself about someone bringing store-bought mashed potatoes again, bless their heart. The community potluck was a big deal in Claridge. Every family brought something: green bean casseroles, cranberry relish, meatballs, and slow cookers. The tables sagged under the weight of it all, like they were used to holding more than just food: laughter, stories, quiet glances. It all collected in the room like a second kind of light. I took my usual spot at the back corner, near the emergency exit and the coat rack. I wasn't ready to sit in the middle of things yet, but I was there. That counted. A little girl walked over, maybe 6 or 7, with wild blonde curls and a sweater 2 sizes too big. "This is for you," she said, holding out a drawing done in marker and crayon. It was a picture of a stick figure girl next to a Christmas tree, surrounded by other stick figures with smiling faces. "Why me?" I asked. "You look like someone who needs a family," she said, with the kind of honesty only children get away with. Then she ran off before I could say thank you. I stared at the drawing, unsure if I should laugh or cry. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Helen slid into the seat next to me without asking. She placed a plate in front of me: turkey, stuffing, a perfectly square piece of cornbread. "You didn't get in line," she said. "So I fixed that." "Thanks. Don't make a big deal out of it," she added, already unwrapping a butterscotch candy from her purse. People moved around the room like they belonged there, like the building breathed easier when it was full. Laughter bounced off the walls. Babies cried. The radiator hissed in the corner. It was the kind of noise that didn't ask for attention, but offered comfort just by existing. And then I saw Travis. He stood near the drinks table, his flannel sleeves rolled up, arms crossed. He wasn't eating, just watching, making sure the cider dispenser didn't run dry, refilling the hot chocolate when no one else noticed it was empty. He caught me looking and gave a small nod. I returned it. He walked over later, not with words, but with a paper box. Inside were homemade cinnamon rolls, still warm. He placed them in the center of the table and stepped back, like he wasn't the one who made them. "They're good," I said. He shrugged. "They're just flour and sugar." I tore off a piece and took a bite. "They're more than that." He didn't answer, but he didn't walk away either. As the evening wore on, someone in a red flannel Santa suit came in, handing out little bags of candy and playing Christmas tunes on a harmonica. Helen laughed so hard she had to lean against the wall. Pastor Ray danced a little two-step with a woman in a wheelchair. No one looked uncomfortable. No one seemed like they wanted to be anywhere else. After the tables were cleared, I stayed to help wipe down surfaces. Travis and I moved in quiet tandem, passing the bleach spray bottle back and forth like we were on some invisible team. At the end of it, he handed me a folded napkin. It wasn't clean, it had cinnamon sugar dust on it, but written in neat blocky letters was my name, just that. No message, no signature, just Lena, in all caps. I don't know why that mattered so much, but it did. Later, when I sat alone again, I pulled the drawing from the little girl out of my pocket and unfolded it beside the napkin. I stared at the stick figures. None of them had names, but I imagined one of them did now. I opened my notebook and wrote, "I've never known this kind of full." It wasn't the food. I came back to Claridge in winter, same roads, same snow, but I was no longer the same girl. 15 years had passed, but the town looked almost exactly as I remembered. The diner still had the flickering neon sign, though someone had finally fixed the E. The church steeple stood just as tall, its bell tower dusted in snow, like time hadn't dared touch it. A few new shops had popped up along Main Street, a bookstore with a cat in the window, a cafe that served espresso with oat milk, but most things remained the same, except me. The purple scarf still hung in my closet, though its edges had frayed with time. I didn't wear it that day, not because I didn't love it, but because I wanted to keep it whole, untouched by what I knew was coming. The Hope Center stood where the old garage used to be. Travis had built it up from the skeleton of that building, turned it into a space for teens to learn skills, get warm meals, talk to someone who listened without judgment. I donated the first set of computers back when I could barely afford them. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was a quiet thank you. That morning, I was sorting boxes near the front when Marcy, one of the high schoolers who spent most afternoons hiding behind her sketchbook, handed me a piece of folded paper. "Someone's asking for you," she said. "Two people, actually. They're waiting in the front." I nodded, trying to prepare myself, but nothing really prepares you for ghosts that show up wearing winter coats and desperation. Earl and Darlene Monroe stood by the reception desk like they owned the place, or wanted to. My father's once proud frame had sagged beneath the weight of time. His jacket hung loose on his shoulders, his beard unkempt. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, her hands clutched around a purse like it held the last pieces of her dignity. "Lena," she breathed, voice brittle. "It's been so long." "Not long enough," I said, keeping my tone even. My father cleared his throat. We didn't know where else to go," I crossed my arms. "There are shelters in Missoula. You passed 3 on your way here." "We lost everything," my mother said. "The house, his job, my pension. We're struggling." I studied them, not with cruelty, but with clarity. They were older, slower, but their eyes hadn't changed. Still calculating, still waiting to see what they could get. I didn't raise my voice, didn't flinch. "You left me in a parking lot," I said. "With $5 and no coat. You didn't call, didn't write, didn't wonder if I made it through the night." My father took a step forward. "You turned out all right, didn't you?" That line hit like a cold slap. "I turned out the way I did because someone else caught me when you dropped me." They didn't speak. Silence filled the space between us like a wall neither of us could climb. I handed them a flyer from the table. It listed local services, places that could help with food, temporary housing, medical support. "This is what I can give you," I said. "Compassion. The same kind strangers gave me." My mother's lip trembled. "We're your parents." I met her eyes. Number U were a warning. They left not long after, the flyer crushed in my father's fist, his steps unsteady. They didn't thank me. I didn't expect them to. Later that evening, I walked to the old cemetery just outside of town. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling each step. I carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, something I hadn't touched in years. Ray and Helen had both passed within months of each other, years ago now. Their names were carved into twin stones beneath a row of pines. Someone had placed holly branches nearby. I knelt between them and gently unwrapped the cloth. The purple scarf still smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. I laid it across the base of their markers, smoothing it flat with both hands. "You gave me everything," I whispered. and never asked for a thing in return. The wind carried the sound away. On my way back through town, I stopped by the mailbox outside the center. A letter had arrived, a simple envelope with no return address. Inside was a drawing colored in soft pencil of a stick figure girl holding hands with a group beneath a tree. There was a name scribbled at the bottom, Marcy, and on the back, in block letters, "Because of you, I stayed." I sat alone in the office that night, reading that note under the soft hum of fluorescent lights. My hands shook not from cold, but from the way something long sealed had opened inside me. I pulled out the old notebook I'd kept all those years. Most of its pages were filled now, but the final one remained blank. I uncapped a pen and wrote the last entry. "You're not invisible. You never were. I never expected to return to Claridge with anything more than memories. But the quiet kindness I once received here became the thread that rewove the fabric of my life. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a scarf, a sandwich, a name spoken softly, can leave the deepest marks. We often forget that judgment is loud, but kindness is patient, and it has a way of finding its way back to us when we need it most. So if this story reminded you of someone you once helped, or someone who once helped you, maybe today's a good day to pass it on. Sometimes just making room at the table is enough.